We live in a world that celebrates illusion, where filters make faces flawless, where success is often just branding, where happiness is sold, not cultivated, and where telling the truth can feel more dangerous than telling a lie. From the moment we wake up, we're bombarded with curated realities, people smiling through pain, preaching virtue while hiding vice, pretending to know while being utterly lost. But the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we hear from others. They're the ones we whisper to ourselves. I'm fine. I'll change tomorrow. I need this to be happy. Small, harmless maybe, but each one adds weight. And over time, we begin to carry a burden we don't even realize we're holding. The burden of living a life not rooted in truth. There's a reason the Buddha didn't just speak of truth as a virtue. He taught it as a liberation. Not a commandment to obey, but a door. A quiet, unwavering door that leads inward. In Pali, the word for truth is Sacca, and it's one of the 10 perfections on the path to enlightenment. Not just truth in speech, but in being. Truth in how you show up, how you feel pain, how you acknowledge desire, how you see the world without distortion, without resistance. And yet, truth is not fashionable. We live in a culture where image is everything and vulnerability is seen as weakness. Where to be honest is to risk rejection. Where even in spiritual communities, people trade authenticity for appearance. Wearing robes of peace while their minds are burning with restlessness. But if you've ever sat alone with yourself in silence, you know that pretending doesn't bring peace. You know that the smiles fade, the praise evaporates, and only one question remains. Am I living true? There's a story from ancient times of a monk who was threatened by bandits. They held a blade to his chest and said, "Tell us where your fellow monks are hiding or you die." He looked into their eyes and said calmly, "I would rather die than speak falsely." He was beaten, left for dead, but he did not betray truth. He didn't do it to be noble. He didn't do it for heaven. He did it because his mind was free. And in that freedom, death had no hold over him. Now most of us won't face swords or bandits, but every day we are tested in quieter ways. Do I lie on this resume to get the job? Do I pretend to agree just to avoid conflict? Do I wear this mask because I'm afraid to be seen? And when we choose falsehood, even in small doses, something in us begins to fragment. We become actors in a play that never ends. Always performing, always hiding, never at home. That's the hidden cost of dishonesty. It doesn't just break trust with others. It breaks trust with ourselves. We no longer believe our own thoughts. We question our worth. We fear silence because silence reveals too much. But truth is simple, not always easy, not always convenient, but simple. It doesn't need decoration, it doesn't scream, it doesn't convince, it just is. The Buddha once said, "Even though it may cost one's life, a noble person does not speak falsely." This isn't just a moral guideline, it's a pointer to something much deeper. When you speak the truth, you align with reality. When you align with reality, you suffer less, because suffering in its deepest form is the resistance to what is, and truthfulness is the end of resistance. It's the moment you say, "I am in pain. I was wrong. I don't know. I am afraid." And somehow in the honesty comes clarity, comes lightness, comes healing. So why do we lie? Because we're afraid of being unloved, afraid of looking weak, afraid that if people saw the real us, they'd walk away. But the paradox is, it is only in truth that love becomes real. It is only in truth that strength is born. And it is only in truth that peace becomes possible. When we peel back the lies, when we stop pretending, when we no longer armor ourselves with illusion. What's left? Just you, raw, unpolished, real. And that in the eyes of the Dharma is more than enough. Because true happiness is not pleasure, it's not comfort, it's not success, it's freedom. and there is no freedom without truth. So here is the invitation, not to be perfect, not to confess to the world, but to come home to honesty quietly, humbly, courageously, to meet yourself where you are, to stop running, to rest in what is real. Because when truth becomes your foundation, nothing can shake you. And slowly, as truth ripples through your thoughts, your speech, your way of being, something begins to shift, a lightness arises, your words carry weight, your presence becomes clear. Your heart softens, and the journey inward begins. Where does this journey lead? Not to perfection, not to fame, but toward a deeper peace. The kind that no one can give you, and no one can take away. To walk that path, though, we must first understand. What did the Buddha really mean when he spoke of truth as a perfection? Not as a rule, but as a revolution of the heart. Let's go there next. When the Buddha spoke of the path to liberation, he never promised it would be easy, but he promised it would be real. Not a fantasy to escape into, but a truth to awaken to. And at the very heart of that truth, woven into every step, every teaching, every breath of the path, is one simple, powerful word: Sacca. In Pali, Sacca means truth, but not just truth as we know it. Not just about honesty in words or facts in conversation. It's a truth of being, a way of living that is aligned with reality, with Dharma, with the way things actually are. The Buddha didn't treat truth as a side virtue. He elevated it as one of the 10 perfections, those transcendent qualities that carry a person across the ocean of suffering to the far shore of enlightenment. Right alongside generosity, patience, wisdom, and determination, he placed truthfulness. Not because it sounds noble, but because without truth, nothing else holds. Imagine building a temple on sand. You can craft every detail perfectly, the statues, the incense, the chants. But if the foundation shifts with every wave, everything crumbles. Truth is that foundation. When your mind rests on truth, it becomes stable. When your speech flows from truth, it becomes trustworthy. When your actions reflect truth, they become transformative. This is why the Buddha once said, "Though one may offer 100 pots of food 3 times a day for 100 years, the merit of one moment of truthful speech surpasses them all." Let that sink in. One single moment of genuine truthfulness is more powerful than a lifetime of rituals without integrity. But why is that? Because truthfulness is alignment. It unites your speech with your mind with your heart with the Dharma. Without truth, the mind becomes scattered, constantly adjusting, performing, pretending. But when we tell the truth even once, the mind becomes whole. You stop juggling the stories. You stop hiding. You become transparent, first to yourself, then to the world. And from that transparency arises peace. The Buddha himself was the embodiment of this peace. He never claimed divinity. He never exaggerated. He never used words to manipulate. When someone asked, "Are you a god?" he simply replied, "No, I am awake." Not a title, not a claim, just a fact, just truth. There is a story of a young prince named Vesantara in a past life of the Buddha. He was tested with immense suffering, losing wealth, his home, even his beloved children. But he held on to one thing, his truthfulness. In his deepest sorrow, he made a solemn vow. "Let the earth be my witness. Never have I broken my word, never have I deceived." And at that moment the ground trembled. The gods rejoiced, because even the universe responds when truth is upheld. Now, we might not be princes. We may never take vows before celestial beings, but in our own quiet ways, we are tested daily. Will I speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable? Will I admit my mistake, even if it humbles me? Will I live with integrity, even when no one is watching? These aren't just moral questions. They're spiritual thresholds. And each time you choose truth over illusion, you take a step further on the path the Buddha walked. In fact, truthfulness is so central to the path. It appears in multiple places in the Buddha's teachings. It's part of the 5 precepts. Abstain from false speech. It's woven into the noble 8-fold path, right speech, which begins with speaking truthfully. And it forms the core of right view, seeing reality as it is, not as we want it to be. Because if you lie to others, you'll lie to yourself. If you lie to yourself, you'll lie to reality. And if you lie to reality, you'll suffer. But here's the beautiful paradox. Truth is already here. You don't have to create it. You don't have to fight for it. You only have to stop running from it. Like the moon behind clouds, truth is never gone, only hidden. And when we sit still, when we drop the performance, when we let silence speak, truth rises effortlessly. Sometimes it rises as pain, sometimes as insight, sometimes as relief, but always it brings us back to what is real. The Buddha was not asking us to become saints. He was inviting us to become honest. And that honesty, about our greed, our fears, our longings, is not a weakness. It is the beginning of transformation, because once you stop pretending, you can begin to see. And once you see, you can begin to let go. So ask yourself, gently, where in my life am I not being truthful? Where am I still hiding? What am I afraid would happen if I was fully honest with myself, with others? Don't answer quickly, just feel the questions. Because sometimes the questions themselves are the beginning of awakening. When the Buddha taught Sacca, he wasn't handing out commandments. He was offering a compass, a way to navigate the storms of delusion, a way to walk through this chaotic world without losing your center. And that compass always points inward, toward integrity, toward clarity, toward a life where your inner and outer worlds are no longer in conflict. This is not just truth, this is freedom, but freedom doesn't come all at once. It begins in the smallest moments. When you choose honesty over ease, stillness over reaction, reality over illusion. In those moments, a deeper happiness begins to take root, not the kind that fades when circumstances change, but the kind that endures, because it's built on something unshakable. As we keep walking, there's something else we must face, something we often overlook. What really happens when we lie, not just outside, but within? What are the hidden costs of deception? To our minds, our relationships, our ability to love and trust. That's where we go next. Not every lie is loud. Some arrive in silence, in the things we don't say, the truths we avoid, the moments we smile when we're actually breaking inside. We tend to think of lying as something external, words we speak to manipulate, to hide, to impress. But the deepest deceptions aren't spoken. They're stored, buried beneath layers of "I'm fine," wrapped in justifications like "it's for their good," or numbed by stories we repeat until we forget they were ever false. But the mind never forgets. It records every twist, every compromise, not to punish us, but because it was built for truth. The human mind, when untangled, craves alignment. And when we lie, especially to ourselves, we tear that alignment apart. Think of a river, clear, flowing, unobstructed. Now drop one stone of dishonesty. It barely makes a ripple, then another, and another. At first, the river still flows. But over time, it slows, clogs, stagnates. This is what deception does to the mind. Each lie is a stone that disrupts the natural current of clarity. And soon, we no longer trust our own waters. This is why the Buddha taught that falsehood is not just unethical, it is unwholesome, because it generates conflict, not only between us and others, but within ourselves. The moment you lie, a fracture is born. One part of you speaks. Another part watches silently, knowing the truth was just betrayed. That's the beginning of inner war. You may still go on smiling, working, teaching even, but beneath it all, something starts to ache. guilt, shame, a subtle anxiety that never fully leaves, the tension of holding together a version of yourself that isn't real. And eventually, even in moments of quiet, that voice returns. You're not being honest. No matter how far we climb outwardly, if our inner world is built on deception, it cannot stand. This is why peace and dishonesty cannot share the same house, because peace is trust. And when you lie, you break the most sacred trust of all, the trust between you and your own mind. In the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha said, "There is no evil like falsehood. A liar who has transgressed truth cuts off the root of the Dhamma." Why such strong words? Because without truth, there is no ground for insight to grow. You may sit in meditation for hours, chant the suttas, wear robes of a monk. But if your foundation is deceit, the mind remains restless, agitated, split. There is a reason great masters value simplicity, because simplicity is clarity. Clarity is alignment, and alignment is peace. But lies, especially the subtle ones, scatter the mind. They create endless mental loops. What did I say before? Did they believe me? What if they find out? This constant mental traffic becomes a prison built not of bars, but of distortions. And here's what's even more tragic. The more we lie, the more we have to lie, to cover the first lie, to maintain the illusion, to hold the image, until it becomes exhausting just to be. You wake up and wear a mask so convincingly, you forget how your real face looks. But truthfulness is rest, not rest as in sleep, but rest as in release. The deep exhale that comes when you no longer have to pretend, when your mind is no longer chasing approval, when your words don't need filters, when your presence no longer performs. That is the beginning of peace. There's a quiet power in someone who doesn't lie. You feel it. Their words don't dazzle, but they land. Their presence doesn't shout, but it resonates. Because something in you recognizes this person is whole. They are not divided against themselves. They are not hiding. And even if you disagree with them, you trust them. That's what truthfulness gives you. Not applause, not fame, but wholeness. And wholeness is the soil where peace takes root. Of course, truthfulness doesn't mean we shout every thought we have. It doesn't mean we weaponize honesty. It means we live in harmony with what is real. It means we stop twisting ourselves to be palatable, impressive, or acceptable. It means we become honest, not just with our lips, but with our silence, with our choices, with how we live. So ask yourself, where do I feel the most tired in my life? What part of me feels constantly tense, constantly guarded? Could it be that I'm holding up a version of myself that isn't true? These questions are not accusations. They are invitations, invitations to unclench, to tell the truth if only to yourself, because that moment might be the first moment of real peace. The good news is, truth doesn't require perfection. It only requires courage. Courage to stop running, courage to stop explaining, courage to sit down with your own reflection and say, this is me, messy, learning but honest. And in that honesty, the healing begins. Because when you no longer need to lie, you no longer need to suffer. We often chase peace through achievement, control, or distraction. But the Buddha's teaching points to something far simpler. That peace is already here, just on the other side of illusion. But how do we begin to walk that path? How do we turn this fragile seed of truthfulness into a living, breathing part of our spiritual life? Not just in theory, but in real moments, with real people, in the messiness of daily life. That's the doorway we approach next. Truth isn't just an ethical suggestion, it's the gateway to awakening. The Buddha didn't separate truthfulness from wisdom. He placed them side by side like two wings of a bird. Because to walk the path of liberation, you don't just need to see clearly. You need to live clearly, and truthfulness is that clarity in motion. We often think of enlightenment as some far-off mystical experience, a lightning bolt of insight, a final moment of stillness, a glowing state untouched by the world. But the Buddha taught something much more grounded. He taught that enlightenment is a process of purification, not of becoming something new, but of removing everything false, every illusion, every mask, every distortion, until all that remains is what's real. And that process begins not with brilliance, but with honesty, brutal, beautiful honesty, the kind that sees your cravings for what they are, that acknowledges your fears without hiding behind them, that no longer performs for an audience, external or internal. This is why the Buddha placed truthfulness at the very beginning of the path. In right speech, the third step of the Noble Eightfold Path. Because speech is not just about communication, it's a mirror of your mind. And if your words are twisted, your thoughts are tangled, if your mouth lies, your consciousness is in conflict. But right speech doesn't start in the mouth. It starts in the heart. To speak truth, you must first feel truth. To feel truth, you must first face truth. To face truth, you must first stop running from what's uncomfortable. And that's where most people get stuck. You see, enlightenment isn't reserved for saints. It's available to the honest, to those who are willing to meet themselves without turning away. This is what the Buddha did under the Bodhi tree. He didn't fight his mind. He didn't deny the demons that rose. He sat, he saw, he stayed. And that seeing raw and fearless became awakening. But he didn't get there overnight. For many lifetimes, the Buddha practiced the 10 paramis, the 10 perfections. Truthfulness, or Sacca, was among them. There's a powerful story from one of his past lives. He once made a vow to speak only the truth, no matter the cost. And when tested, when the lie could have saved him, protected him, made things easier, he still chose truth. Because he understood something most of us forget. If you lie to survive, you're only surviving a false version of yourself. The real you, the awakened you, only lives in truth. This doesn't mean we become harsh, cold, or rigid. Truthfulness in Buddhism isn't about brutality. It's about clarity. It's not just about what you say. It's about what you align with. When your actions match your values. When your thoughts reflect your reality. When your presence no longer wears armor. You become steady. And that steadiness is the soil of insight. It's why great masters radiate peace. Not because they're perfect, but because they're honest. Utterly, courageously honest. They're not pretending to be peaceful. They are peaceful because they're not fighting themselves. Their minds have nothing to hide. Their hearts have nothing to defend. Their lives are not divided by deceit. That's the quiet power of a truthful life. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the foundation of mindfulness, the Buddha outlines how to observe body, feeling, mind, and phenomena as they are. Not as we want them to be, not as we fear them to be, but as they are. This simple phrase, as it is the root of both mindfulness and truthfulness. To be mindful is to be honest. To be honest is to stop editing reality. And when you stop editing reality, you begin to experience it directly. That direct experience is wisdom, and wisdom liberates. But here's the subtle trap. Many seekers crave spiritual experiences more than spiritual truth. They want visions, bliss, certainty, something to post about, something to feel awakened. But the Buddha warned against this thirst. He said the path is not about sensation, it's about seeing. And you cannot see clearly if your mind is fogged with falsehood. You cannot walk to freedom if your feet are tied by self-deception. So how do we bring this truthfulness into our lives? Practically, humbly, consistently. We begin where we are. In the moment, we resist telling the whole story. We pause. In the moment, we feel the urge to impress. We ask, what am I trying to prove? In the moment, we see ourselves cutting corners. We remember. Every lie delays our own awakening. These are not grand gestures. They are micro moments of truth. And they matter. Because enlightenment isn't built in one great leap. It's built in 1,000 small steps of integrity. The path to awakening isn't reserved for monks in forests or sages in caves. It's open to anyone willing to be real with their suffering, to be real with their attachments, to be real with their longing for peace. Truthfulness isn't something we add to the path. It is the path, because only when we stop lying to the world and to ourselves can we finally hear the Dharma, not as philosophy, but as truth. And truth, once known deeply, begins to reorder everything. How you speak, how you love, how you let go. That's not just the result of awakening. That's the sign that it's already unfolding. But the road is not always easy. Because sometimes, truth comes with a cost. It asks us to leave behind comfort, to risk misunderstanding, to let go of images we've built for years. And that's where courage is tested. In the next step of our journey, we'll meet that moment face to face. What happens when truth demands a price we're not sure we're ready to pay? Let's step into that question together. There comes a moment in every honest life when the truth isn't easy anymore, when it no longer feels like a virtue, but a burden. It might be in a conversation where silence would have saved face, in a relationship where a well-placed lie could have preserved the peace, or in a system where truth is inconvenient, dangerous even. And suddenly, honesty doesn't feel spiritual. It feels costly. That's when we're tested. Not in theory, but in life. The Buddha never promised that truth would make us popular. He promised it would make us free. And freedom, as it turns out, isn't cheap. It costs our illusions. It costs our masks. Sometimes it even costs our comfort, our reputation, our belonging, because the world doesn't always reward clarity. It rewards conformity. And the moment you choose to live truthfully, fully, you disrupt the game. There's an ancient Buddhist parable that still echoes today. It's the story of Kisa Gautami, a mother who lost her only child. Desperate, shattered, she brought her child's lifeless body to the Buddha, begging him for medicine. The Buddha, with infinite compassion, told her, "Bring me a mustard seed from any home where no one has died." She searched every home in the village, knocking, pleading, but every door told the same story. "Yes, we've lost someone too." She returned exhausted, not with mustard seeds, but with truth, the truth of suffering, the truth that no one escapes loss, the truth that even love cannot shield us from impermanence. And in that painful realization, she awakened. Sometimes truth breaks us open, not to harm us, but to hollow the vessel so light can enter. But our ego doesn't want to be broken. It wants to be admired. It wants control. So it clings to the convenient lie. "I'm fine. I'm in control. This will last forever. They'll never leave. I'll deal with it later." Each small dishonesty is a rope we tie around our own freedom, and each truth we dare to speak is a cut that sets us loose. But let's be honest, truth can hurt. It can disrupt families, shake careers, challenge identities we've worn for years. To live honestly is to walk into discomfort, to tell the truth even when it's messy, even when it invites misunderstanding, even when the world tells you it's smarter to stay quiet. But ask yourself this: what is the real cost of a lie? You may preserve the relationship, but lose the connection. You may avoid the argument, but invite resentment. You may protect your image, but bury your peace. That's not winning. That's slow erosion. The Buddha spoke often of Mara, the tempter, the inner force that tries to pull us away from truth. But Mara doesn't always appear as evil. Sometimes Mara comes dressed as logic, as justification, as being nice. as protecting someone's feelings. But deep down, we know. We feel it in our gut. That small contraction when we withhold the truth. That quiet regret when we walk away from honesty. That tightness in the chest when we perform instead of speak. The cost of honesty may be external, but the cost of lying is always internal. Here's the paradox. Truth may shake your outer world, but it stabilizes your inner one. When you begin to speak and live from truth, you may lose people, but the ones who stay, they're the real ones. You may lose status, but you gain self-respect. You may face storms, but you stop living in fear. Because what's left is you, whole, uncompromised, unhidden. Honesty strips away everything fake, and that's terrifying because for many of us, the fake was how we survived. We smiled when we were hurting. We said yes when our soul screamed no. We wore masks so well we started to forget who we were underneath. But the Dharma calls us back to what's real, back to the root, back to the self that exists before performance, before pretending. That return comes at a cost, but it also brings the only kind of peace that lasts. The monks in the time of the Buddha knew this truth intimately. They left their homes, gave up possessions, renounced status and name, not because they hated the world, but because they were done lying to themselves. They saw the illusion for what it was, and they chose to be honest with reality, no matter how bare. That is the cost. And the reward. You may not be ready to walk into the forest, but every day you're offered a small forest of your own. A choice to speak the truth or not, to live in alignment or not, to be seen as you are or to keep hiding. Each choice shapes your path, and eventually you realize truth isn't just something you speak, it's something you become. When you live in truth, you become the Dharma itself, not a follower, not a seeker, but a living mirror of reality. And that is freedom worth any price. But what about those moments when we do fall short, when fear wins, when we slip back into old patterns, into silence, into pretending? How do we come back to truth without shame? In the next chapter, we'll explore the art of returning. Not perfectly, but humbly. Not with judgment, but with presence. Because truth is not a destination. It's a practice, and every moment is a chance to begin again. Some truths don't scream, they whisper. And sometimes we only hear them when everything else is quiet. But in today's world, quiet is rare. We're constantly tuned in, scrolling, posting, reacting, surrounded by noise that tells us what to wear, what to believe, who to be. And in that chaos, truth becomes uncomfortable, not because it isn't there, but because it asks too much. It asks us to pause, to look inward, to choose honesty over habit. And in the modern world, that's not easy. Let's begin with a story. One you may have lived yourself, or quietly witnessed in someone else's eyes. Emma had everything that looked like happiness: a stable job, a polite partner, brunch on Sundays, and polite laughs at work. But every night just before sleep, something ached. Not loudly, just enough to make her stare at the ceiling, wondering, is this it? She'd spent years convincing herself to stay. In the relationship, in the career, in the version of herself that made everyone comfortable. But not once had she asked the question that truly mattered. What is my truth? Until one morning she did, and the answer shattered everything. She left, not out of anger, but alignment. Friends were confused, family whispered. But Emma felt light, because when you finally choose truth, you start breathing with lungs that had long forgotten air. The Buddha once said, "Better it is to speak the truth and be reviled than to speak falsely and be praised." And yet in modern life, we often choose comfort over truth, because comfort is easy. It keeps the peace on the surface. It keeps things manageable. But deep inside, the cost accumulates. And one day, it demands to be paid. Through anxiety, burnout, broken relationships, or a soul that feels far from itself. Let's talk about Jay, a successful entrepreneur. On paper, he was winning. TED Talks headlines, seven-figure valuations. But off-stage, Jay was drowning in the pressure of pretending. He hated the work, hated the image. He missed writing poetry. He missed silence. So one day he posted something unexpected, a raw confession, that he was okay, that he was stepping away from the spotlight to find himself again. He expected ridicule. He received resonance. Thousands wrote back, "Thank you. You said what I couldn't. I thought I was alone." And in that moment, Jay learned a modern truth. Sometimes the most radical act of service is to be real, but choosing truth isn't always met with applause. Sometimes it brings resistance. In friendships, you may be called selfish. In families, disloyal. In religion, a heretic. In business, naive. But ask yourself, would you rather betray yourself or disappoint others? Because if you live your life suppressing what's real just to be accepted, you'll wake up one day surrounded by people who love a version of you that doesn't exist. And that is the loneliest place to be. In the Dharma, truth is not about being brutally honest with others. It's about being gently honest with yourself. You don't have to shout your truth. You just have to stop running from it. And in a world built on illusion, on filters, facades, and curated identities, your truth is not just radical, it's sacred. Let's pause here. Think of one place in your life where you've been silent, where truth was present, but you told yourself, not now. It's too much. That moment still lives in you, not as shame, but as invitation. Every moment you choose alignment over avoidance. You carve a path out of suffering. You trade numbness for awareness. You trade performing for peace. The Buddha didn't call us to be perfect. He called us to be awake, to see things as they are, to speak from a place of integrity, to act in a way that leaves no residue on the heart. Truth, in this sense, isn't a weapon, it's a mirror. And when you hold it up, first to yourself, you begin to see where you've been hiding, where you've been shrinking, where you've been wearing masks you outgrew years ago. That's not weakness, that's awakening. You may ask, but what if I lose people? You might, but better to lose the crowd than lose yourself. What if I fail? Failure while living in truth is never real failure. It's refinement. What if I'm not ready? You don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing. Willing to take one small step toward what feels real, even if your voice shakes, even if your hands tremble, even if no one claps. In today's world, choosing truth might look like saying no when you've always said yes, leaving the job that drains your soul, telling your partner what you've been too afraid to admit, writing the book you thought no one would understand, sitting with your emotions instead of numbing them away. Each act, no matter how small, becomes a sacred rebellion against a world that says, just stay comfortable. And for once you say, no, I choose what's real. Truth is a path few walk, not because it's invisible, but because it's inconvenient. But you're already walking. Each time you pause to listen, to feel, to align, you're returning home. And the more you choose truth over comfort, the more the world inside you begins to match the world outside. No more pretending, no more performing, just presence. And presence is where true transformation begins. But the question remains, what happens when we speak the truth and it hurts others? Can honesty and compassion walk hand in hand? In the next chapter, we step into that delicate terrain where truth must meet tenderness and where wisdom teaches us how to speak without breaking what matters most. Truth doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in the way you greet a stranger, in how you answer "I'm fine" when you're not, in whether you honor your word when no one's watching. In the ancient texts, truthfulness, Sacca, wasn't just about grand confessions or bold declarations. It was about the tiny, everyday choices, the subtle moments where we either lean into what's real or drift just a little into illusion. In today's world, truth is often romanticized. We admire the rebels, the truth-tellers, the ones who speak their mind. But real truthfulness, what the Buddha taught, wasn't loud or aggressive. It was integrity in stillness, alignment in silence, honesty without ego. So how do we actually practice it? Not just talk about it, not just admire it from a distance, but live it, breathe it, build our lives around it. Let's begin simply. 1. Speak only what is true. Yes, it sounds obvious, but pause here for a moment. Every day we're tempted to embellish stories, to flatter, to protect egos, to avoid discomfort. You tell a friend, "I'm just running late," when really you didn't want to go. You say, "No worries," when inside something does hurt. You compliment someone, not from sincerity, but out of politeness. And yet every one of those tiny moments becomes a seed, a crack in your own integrity, not because you meant harm, but because truth felt too raw. Practicing truth means choosing clarity over comfort, not with harshness, but with courage. It means pausing before you speak and asking, is this kind? Is this necessary? Is this true? That's not just wisdom, that's mindfulness in action. 2. Live what you say. Truthfulness isn't just verbal, it's embodied. You say you value peace, but do you seek drama? You teach kindness, but do you snap at those closest to you? You speak of compassion, but do you turn away from your own pain? Living truthfully means aligning your words, your actions, your intentions. It means closing the gap between who you are on the outside and who you are on the inside. And that's not perfection, that's presence. 3. Stop pretending. This one's hard, because most of us were taught from childhood to perform, to be agreeable, to hide sadness, to wear the okay mask. But pretending is exhausting, and the longer you wear the mask, the harder it becomes to remember your own face. Living truthfully means being real, with your joy and your pain. It means allowing others to see your humanity, even if it's messy, even if it's vulnerable. Because authenticity isn't weakness, it's the soil where trust grows. 4. Keep your promises. This is one of the Buddha's core teachings on Sacca. If you say you will do something, do it. Simple, direct, sacred. Because when you break your own word, you don't just disappoint others, you fracture your own self-respect. Truthfulness in action is about being reliable. It's about showing up, not because it's convenient, but because your word is your practice. 5. Be true when no one's watching. This is where the path becomes real, when no one will know, when there's no applause, when silence wraps around your choice. Do you still choose what's honest? Do you still honor what you said? This is where Sacca becomes a way of being, not performance, not philosophy, but integrity that lives in the bones. There's a beautiful story of a monk named Tissa. He was asked to carry water every day up a steep hill to fill a tank for others. No one praised him. No one noticed when he was sick. One day, a visitor asked, "Why do you do this, day after day, with no recognition?" Tissa smiled. "I carry water not for others to see, but so my heart remains clear when I see it." That's truthfulness. Not the kind that begs for validation, but the kind that purifies your own reflection. So what stops us from living like this? Often it's fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear that we'll lose love, opportunity, approval. But truth doesn't destroy what's real. It only dissolves what was never meant to stay. And when you begin to live truthfully, the right people will stay, the right path will open, and your inner world will finally rest. Let's return to daily life. When a friend asks how you're doing, pause Answer with honesty, even gently. When your body says rest, but your calendar screams go, choose presence. When something feels off in a conversation, name it with compassion. When you're tempted to make yourself smaller to fit in, don't. Each of these is a doorway, not to perfection, but to freedom, because practicing truthfulness isn't a demand. It's a return, a remembering that you are not here to perform. You're here to live fully and honestly. Background music rises slightly, hopeful, steady rhythm. When we live this way, we change more than just ourselves. Our relationships deepen, our presence becomes healing, and we stop fearing being found out. Because we no longer hide. This is the gift of Sacca, not a commandment, but an invitation to be real, to be whole, to be free. There's a kind of truth that cannot be spoken, not because it's a secret, but because language is too small to hold it. We've spent so much time talking about honesty, telling the truth, living the truth, holding ourselves accountable to what is real. But the Buddha pointed to something deeper, a level of truthfulness that goes beyond words, beyond moral conduct, beyond social integrity. It is the kind of truth that lives at the heart of awakening. It is being true to the Dharma itself. Let's slow down for a moment. What is the Dharma? Is it a teaching, a path, a way of life? Yes, but also no. The Dharma is not just what's written in books, or chanted in temples, or preached from platforms. It is the natural law that governs all things, the truth of impermanence, the law of cause and effect, the path of liberation woven into the very fabric of existence. It's the wind in the trees, the stillness between two breaths, the suffering you feel when you grasp, and the peace that comes when you let go. So to be truthful in the deepest sense is not just to be honest with others. It is to live in alignment with reality itself. There's a passage in the Dhammapada that whispers this wisdom. Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. And yet even that one word is not the Dharma. The Dharma is not what is said, but what is lived. Consider this. A monk may memorize the entire canon, recite sutras daily, teach hundreds of followers, but if he clings to ego, seeks praise, fears silence, has he truly touched the Dharma? On the other hand, a humble farmer who bows with gratitude to the earth, who lives gently, speaks truthfully, and lets go of what he cannot control, may be closer to the Dharma than he knows. Truthfulness, in this higher sense, is not about how many truths you speak, but how deeply you embody what is. It's not performance, it's presence. To be true to the Dharma means letting go when things change, because impermanence is the law. Responding with compassion, because all beings suffer. Observing your thoughts without judgment, because the mind is not the self. Releasing craving, because craving is the root of sorrow. It means living not by preference, but by wisdom. It means seeing clearly, even when the truth hurts, and choosing not to turn away. But here's where it gets subtle. Many people believe in the Dharma, they wear beads, they use quotes, they claim insight, but belief is not enough. As the Buddha said, just as a flood sweeps away a sleeping village, craving will sweep away one who only recites the Dharma but does not live it. Real truthfulness means we don't just talk about non-attachment, we practice it. We don't just praise mindfulness, we return to it again and again when the mind wanders. We don't just quote all things are impermanent. We learn to smile even as things fall apart. This kind of truth is not poetic. It's not for applause, it's transformative. It burns away illusion, layer by layer, until only freedom remains. There's a Zen saying, when you hear the Dharma, do not cling to the words. Be like a mirror, reflect, but do not hold. Because even the most sacred words can become cages. If we mistake the finger for the moon, truthfulness then is not to grasp the Dharma, but to let it move through you, to live it, silently, naturally, without decoration. One day, a disciple asked the Buddha, "Master, how will we know if we are walking the path?" The Buddha replied, "If suffering lessens, if kindness increases, if craving falls away, then you are living in harmony with truth." Not beliefs, not theories, not status, just simple transformation from the inside out. So how do we practice this kind of truthfulness? Let's be practical. When anger rises, don't suppress it but observe its impermanence. When something beautiful comes, enjoy it but don't grasp it. When loss comes, don't deny it but meet it with presence. When praise comes, smile but don't let it define you. This is being true to the Dharma. It's not about being perfect. It's about being aligned. No need to be loud. No need to explain yourself. Just live like a candle that quietly gives light. And maybe that's the highest honesty of all. Not needing to prove anything. Not needing to decorate your truth. Not needing to cling to even the idea of truth. Just living it, breathing it, letting it flow through every step you take. When truth becomes less about words and more about being, you'll find something unshakable inside you. Peace that doesn't depend on outcome. Joy that doesn't beg for attention. Wisdom that doesn't need to speak. As we draw near the end of this journey, one question quietly emerges. If truth is so powerful, so liberating, why is it still so rare? Why do so many still choose illusion, even knowing the cost? That's what we'll explore next. In a place where honesty meets resistance, and where even the sincere stumble. The unseen layers of self-deception. The most dangerous lies are the ones we believe. Truth is not just a virtue, it's a blueprint for karma. And karma, despite all the mystical interpretations, is really just cause and effect in motion. Every thought, every word, every action. They don't just vanish when they're done. They echo, they build, they shape the architecture of your inner world. And if your words are lies, your thoughts are poisoned, and your actions are rooted in illusion, what kind of structure do you think you're living in? Would it feel safe, stable, peaceful, or would it always be cracking? Let's start here. Karma is not punishment. It's not cosmic revenge. It's relationship. Between your intentions and their unfolding. Between who you are now and what you're becoming. And truthfulness, Sacca, as the Buddha taught, is the stabilizing force in that relationship. When you act in truth, you align with reality. And when you align with reality, suffering begins to dissolve. Why? Because reality never resists itself. Only the illusion does. Think of truth like gravity. You don't have to believe in it. You just have to respect it. If you jump off a cliff pretending gravity doesn't exist, it won't matter how sincere your illusion was. Karma is the same. You may lie to others. You may lie to yourself. But the universe doesn't take sides, it simply reflects. And the more distorted your truth, the more distorted your karma. The Buddha once said, "One who speaks falsely goes to hell. One who having done says, 'I did not do.' Both become equal after death. People of base action in the world beyond. But what does hell mean? Is it a fiery pit? Or is it simply the natural consequence of a life lived out of alignment, a mind tormented by its own contradictions, a heart that cannot rest because it fears being seen, a soul that grows weary of pretending? That is suffering, and it's real. So, what does karma built on truth look like? Imagine waking up each day without needing to remember who you pretended to be yesterday. No secrets to juggle, no masks to adjust. No fear of being found out, just clarity, consistency, peace. Your mind becomes light. Your heart becomes strong. Your relationships deepen because people trust you. And slowly this truthfulness begins to reshape your karma, from chaos to coherence, from suffering to stillness. There's a story from the Buddha's time. A man asked the Blessed One, Why is it that some people, despite doing good, seem to suffer, and others, even if they lie and cheat, appear to flourish? The Buddha answered with deep calm. Just because fruit hasn't ripened does not mean the tree is barren. Karma takes time, but it never forgets. A single act of truth today may flower in ways you never expected, in moments you may never see. But that flower will still bloom. Let's bring this closer to home. In your everyday life, how do you build karma through truth? It's not only in the big confessions. It's in the small integrity, saying no when you mean no. Not exaggerating to sound impressive. Admitting when you're wrong without making excuses. Listening without pretending to understand. Speaking kindly even when it's hard. Each of these plants a seed. And those seeds over time grow into the tree that is your future. The fruit, not just external success, but lasting happiness, the kind that cannot be bought, borrowed, or broken. But here's the paradox. Truthfulness might bring discomfort in the short term. You may lose friends, offend egos, be misunderstood. You may find yourself walking alone sometimes, quietly, without applause, but over time, the world starts to shift around you. You attract authenticity, you magnetize peace, and that inner clarity begins to reflect outward. You smile more, your sleep deepens, your steps feel lighter, not because life got easier, but because you stopped resisting what is. That is the Dharma at work. That is karma ripening in harmony. Here's a truth few talk about. Most people aren't afraid of karma, they're afraid of accountability. Because karma asks you to look in the mirror, not to shame yourself, but to wake up. And truthfulness is the mirror. It shows you your face, your motives, your contradictions, not to condemn, but to liberate. Because when you see clearly, you choose wisely, and wise choices are the root of lasting joy. So what are you building today? A house of hollow praise, or a temple of truth? Every thought is a brick, every word is a beam, every intention part of the design. You are the architect of your happiness, and truth is your strongest foundation. You don't need to rush, just stay honest, stay aware, stay aligned. Because truth, when practiced with mindfulness, becomes the compass that steers your karma toward freedom. Imagine this. You wake up one morning, and you no longer need to pretend. No roles to perform, no lies to maintain, no masks to adjust, just you, clear, open, free. That moment is not a fantasy. It is what happens when the mask finally falls, and truth becomes your way of being. For most of us, life becomes a collection of roles. The one who's always strong, the one who's always agreeable, the one who always seems fine. We build identities to be loved, accepted, admired. But behind every role is a cost, a small death of the real self. And what do we trade it for? Approval, validation, a false sense of safety. But here's the truth. Nothing inauthentic can bring true peace, and nothing true needs to be hidden. In the teachings of the Buddha, truthfulness wasn't just a moral rule. It was a path to liberation, not just from sin, but from self-deception. Because once you start telling the truth to others, you eventually have to tell the truth to yourself. And that is where real awakening begins. You see, there's a unique joy that arises when you no longer need to perform. A joy that's not loud, but quietly radiant. A peace that doesn't depend on who's watching, but blossoms simply because you're no longer divided. No more hiding parts of yourself. No more second-guessing every word. No more anxiety from living in fragments. This is the joy of integrity, of wholeness, of finally coming home to yourself. One Zen master once said, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The difference isn't in the tasks, it's in the being. Before truthfulness, you chop wood while wondering what others think. You carry water while pretending you're fine. After truthfulness, every action is clean, whole, simple. No performance, no pressure, just presence. Of course, this doesn't mean life becomes perfect. You'll still face difficult conversations. You'll still feel the pull of old patterns. You may still tremble before speaking certain truths, but now you choose truth anyway, and each time you do, you build strength, not the brittle strength of pride, but the grounded strength of authenticity. You walk lighter, you sleep deeper, you smile without reason, because truth is no longer something you speak. It is who you are, and then something beautiful begins to happen. Your relationships change. People start to trust you, not because you say the right things, but because you say the real things. You attract depth. You create space for others to be honest too. You become safe, not by pleasing everyone, but by being rooted in something unshakable. And that something is truth. The Buddha described nirvana as the end of suffering. But what is suffering if not resisting what is? When we lie, we resist the present. When we pretend, we flee from our essence. When we hide, we disconnect from the moment. But when we live truthfully, we stop fighting life. We stop editing our souls to fit someone else's narrative. We begin to trust that being real is more than enough. And in that space, a deeper kind of happiness takes root, not a fleeting pleasure, not the high of approval, but a calm, enduring joy, the joy of living without masks, the joy of living truthfully. So if you've come this far with us, maybe something within you already knows you're ready to stop pretending, to stop twisting, to stop hiding behind almost truths. You're ready to live in alignment, to choose honesty, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's quiet, even when no one claps, because truth is its own reward, and truthfulness is the soil where lasting happiness grows. Let's breathe together, one last time. Inhale, the freedom of honesty. Exhale, everything false that no longer serves. You are not your roles, you are not your fears, you are not your lies, you are presence, you are clarity, you are truth. Learning to remember itself. If this journey resonated with you, if these reflections stirred something quiet and true within your heart, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. This channel is more than just words. It's a sanctuary, a space for seekers like you, who believe in truth, peace, and the wisdom of awakening. Like, comment, and share this with someone who needs it today. Your ripple may be the light that reaches another's darkness. Thank you for walking this path with us. May your days be honest, your heart be clear, and your life deeply free. Until next time, stay mindful, stay true. Namo Buddhaya.